far back does the written record itself go? You know, like with the New Testament, there was several hundred years before people ever wrote anything.
So what this theory would say is there very well may have been written things that these writers drew upon. More likely, they probably drew upon oral histories that weren't written down. So what this theory would basically say is that the Yahwist working in 10th century Jerusalem is the earliest written that they can document. They may have used written sources before that, but they don't know. They can't identify earlier writings.
Question:
Yes?
Isn't Gilgamesh a model for some of this prior?
Well, it shows up. I mean, it actually the Gilgamesh is a Babylonian
Story.
Story that you'll see that there's some comparisons to, actually contrast to.
Okay.
I'm going to suggest that as we go along, these different writers, and particularly in this case J and P, contribute different ideas about God's creation in our study of the book of Genesis. The Elohist doesn't really show up in the first 11 chapters later on in Genesis, and then the D doesn't show up at all. So in a way we're going to be talking about J and P. And what scholars have kind of come up with is that the first 11 chapters can be divided from these different sources, J and P, like this. So J's story of the creation is actually mostly the second chapter and going through chapter 4. And that the priestly writer's story of creation is the first chapter of Genesis. And we'll see how there are some significant differences in those two stories if you kind of see them as coming from two different places. And so we're going to explore that a little bit. The priestly writers then built in a bridge, if you will, of chapter 5 to explain how we get from Adam to Noah. And then the flood becomes very interesting in that there seems to be a mishmash of different of putting these sources together to tell the story about the flood. We're going to spend at least one day on the flood because it's a fascinating kind of study, especially in trying to figure out how people who had a scientific point of view tried to explain how the flood happened, believing that it literally happened. But Jay's emphasis about the flood is that it's about God's promises, and then P's contribution to the flood story is that it's about covenant, making a new covenant with Israel. And so those are, and we'll get into those. We're not going to try to divide up why those are divided up like that right now. Then there's the table of nations, and each author or school, if you will, contributed different things to that. The Tower of Babel seems to be part of Jay's story, and then going from Noah to Abraham, the 11th chapter, the rest of the 11th chapter is from the priestly writers. So this is kind of how the documentary hypothesis looks at, and in this case, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, as where the sources for the story of Genesis came from. So we're going to be looking at how those different sources, how for instance, somebody writing in the 10th century BC, what were their issues that they were trying to address as compared to somebody writing in the 6th century BC, 400 years later. There were different issues going on that they were addressing theologically as they were writing about how the world came to be. The third thing that I want to introduce is the idea of game theory, or yes, Louise.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, that's fine.
On the documentary hypothesis, you said that was written, what, about 150 years ago? The theory kind of 1800s, and by German scholars, and then but I'd say it's most modern mainline scholars adopt
an aspect of documentary hypothesis. So the third thing is games. And this, you might say, well, how in the world can we be talking about creation and games in the same thing? This famous quote by Albert Einstein, "God does not play dice with the universe," has oftentimes been used by religious people to say, that's right. Everything is well designed by God, and God doesn't take chances with things. God is involved in every aspect of how the world has moved along. What's interesting is Albert Einstein was not really talking about God. He didn't have the idea of a Christian God in mind at all. He said this in response to the emerging school of quantum physics. And he really had problems with the idea of quantum physics early on, and still had, throughout his life he's had issues with it, but then he used quantum physics a lot in his work. But early on, particularly, he really rejected the idea that in quantum physics that there could be random events, that things could happen that are unexplainable, that don't seem to have any cause, that just happen out of randomness, out of chaos. And Albert Einstein, coming from a Newtonian physics kind of perspective, really pushed back on that idea to say that no, there is always a cause and effect for everything that happens. He wasn't talking about God causing it, but that there are laws of the universe, that there's always a cause and effect. And so he made this famous statement. What's interesting, though, is that quantum physics is kind of the science of the day, and most theorists dealing with physics accept the idea that there is randomness in the universe, that things happen for no apparent cause or reason whatsoever, that things just happen. And so this idea of playing dice is an intriguing idea to me, because when it comes to us humans, what's interesting is that we invent games. We invent lots and lots and lots of games. Every society has games, and we like games. But when we create games, we create games out of basically nothing. They're just out in our head. We invent games. And whenever we invent games, we almost always include an element of randomness or chaos or unexplained things. So we write rules, we create boundaries. The football field is 100 yards long, and there's all these rules that you have to follow, and if you break the rules, you get penalized. And there's referees to enforce the rules, and so we have lots of rules, and so we create games with rules. I suppose nobody knows what this is.
Don't know at all.
But then we throw in stuff that makes it crazy, like the shape of the football that just begs for weird bounces and all that kind of thing. And then again, who could explain that play? It's just almost unexplainable. And so the idea of luck, the idea of just getting a lucky bounce and all that kind of stuff comes into play. We make games with built-in randomness, with built-in chaos. We include it. Because if we didn't, if everything in our games was predetermined, they'd be really, really boring, and we'd stop playing them. We like games with stuff in them. We even build in bodily harm risks, to our games, because that makes it exciting. Of course, we have to talk about the Giants. And one of the fascinating things that's been going on over the last couple of weeks is how all of a sudden you hear lots of talk about the baseball gods, and that the gods are involved in how the Giants are playing. Because how can you explain that hit where Hunter Pence is swinging at the ball, the bat breaks in two, and the ball bounces off the head of the bat 3 times to make the ball turn and go, you know, almost a right turn right before it gets to the shortstop, and 3-run score, and you know, the Giants are on their way. There's no explaining that. But that's part of the fun of games, is that you can't explain that. Margaret.
So coming home from work the other night either on NPR or KCBS, there was a commentary that one of the rabbis blew the shofar before the game, or right when they were having a challenging moment, and explaining the history that they always blow this before there's a momentous event.
There we go. Yeah.
So maybe that was one of
the see? What it does is that you're not talking about the physics of it, even though you could explain the physics here, but it's like a round ball being hit by a cylindrical bat that then breaks in two, and then, you know, it defies explanation. But that's what makes baseball so much fun, is that even though there's an incredible number of rules, we built in chaos to it to make it an exciting and fun game to watch, and boy, do we watch it.
You could do a class just on chaos.
Yeah, we could. Well, we're gonna be talking about chaos, because one of the, you know, in our, what we do with our games is that sometimes they're completely by chance. You know, you don't, is there a strategy to a roulette wheel? I suppose there is. I haven't tried it too much. If there is a strategy, I don't know what it is. But we're almost talking pure chance when we're talking about the game of roulette. And for some people, that's really satisfying. That didn't work for me. But more often than not, we build games that have strategies to them, and oftentimes where the game gets interesting is that you're playing with somebody else, like these two little girls here, challenging each other in a game of checkers. And checkers is a fairly simple game, but it has that somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, because that's what we do in our games. It kind of reflects real life in some ways, even more, sometimes even more than real life. And of course, if we look at the game of chess, it's all of, there's hardly any randomness or in it, and it's all about how determined and skilled are you to overcome the strategy of of your opponent. I love that picture. But we like games, and we build those games in. We build chaos and randomness and chance into our world, because that's what our world is like. I would like to suggest that when we look at the story of creation, that idea of what we do with games is part of how we can understand what's going on with creation. That, in fact, even as we talk about God creating Adam and all of that, that there is built-in chaos and built-in randomness to the order that we also often talk about. And this becomes a kind of a key kind of idea that we're going to talk about, particularly next week, as we talk about how the writers of the first chapter, the priestly writers of the first chapter of Genesis, how they talked about God bringing order to chaos without destroying chaos. Chaos is brought under control, but it isn't destroyed. And this is quite different than all of the other creation stories that were going around in those days, like the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all of the other ancient creation stories, which there are many of. They all talk about chaos being destroyed and order winning the day. In the creation account of Genesis, we find order being very important, but it doesn't destroy chaos. It brings chaos into control so that there is a balance. So there is both order and chaos. And that becomes, I think, an interesting theme for us as we look at how and why Genesis 1 through 11 is the way it is. So I encourage you to come back, and we'll see what that's like. Next week what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first chapter and how the priestly writers particularly were very concerned about order, and how it is that they wrote, if you will, or comprised, put together this idea of 6 days of creation to help understand how God brought order to chaos. I encourage you to read ahead if you want, but I will have handouts next week, and invite you to come back, and we'll see how we can look at creation, the game of creation in the book of Genesis. Thank you very much.